Sometimes the cruelest fate is being left to die alone, forgotten by the world. In the scorching desert of New Mexico Territory, 1875, Clara Martinez lies with iron chains binding her legs together, abandoned by outlaws who believed the desert would finish what they started. The sun beats down mercilessly. Vultures circle overhead. Her lips crack and her hope fades to nothing. Then hoofbeats echo across the sand. A lone cowboy appears through the heat waves. Thomas Whitmore has spent years drifting these badlands, but something about this broken woman stirs his conscience. Without hesitation, he draws his knife and cuts through the chains that bind her. What he doesn't know is that saving Clara will make them both targets of the most dangerous gang in the territory. But sometimes mercy demands a price worth paying. What secret drove Clara to risk everything by trying to escape these ruthless men? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first thing Clara Martinez noticed when consciousness returned was the absence of pain. For 3 days, agony had been her constant companion, the bite of iron shackles against her ankles, the relentless burn of desert sun on her exposed skin, the sharp stones that had cut through her dress as she dragged herself across the sand. Now she lay on something soft, something that smelled of sage and leather, and the blessed coolness of shade covered her like a gentle hand. She opened her eyes slowly, afraid that this mercy might be nothing more than a fever dream. Above her stretched a canvas tarp, carefully rigged between 2 mesquite trees to create a shelter. The late afternoon light filtered through the fabric, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. To her left, a small fire crackled beneath a blackened coffee pot, and the rich aroma made her stomach clench with sudden hunger. "You're awake." The voice was low, measured, with the kind of careful tone a man might use when approaching a wounded animal. Clara turned her head and saw him sitting on a fallen log, perhaps 10 feet away, close enough to help if needed, far enough to avoid frightening her. He was older than she'd first thought, maybe 40, with weathered hands and eyes that held the kind of patience that came from long years of solitude. "The chains," she began, her voice nothing more than a whisper, "are gone." He gestured toward the fire, where she could see the twisted metal cooling beside a heavy hammer and chisel. "Took some doing, but they won't trouble you again." Clara tried to sit up, but her body protested with a dozen new aches. The stranger Thomas, she remembered him saying his name was Thomas, rose from his seat and moved closer, his movements careful and deliberate. "Easy now. You've been through hell, and your body needs time to remember how to heal." He knelt beside her makeshift bed, and she could see the concern in his eyes. They were grey like storm clouds, but kind. "Can you tell me your name?" "Clara," she managed. "Clara Martinez." "Well, Miss Martinez, I'm Thomas Whitmore, and I'm wondering how a schoolteacher from Santa Fe ended up chained in the middle of the Jornada del Muerto." The question sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the desert evening. How did he know she was a teacher? How did he know she was from Santa Fe? Her confusion must have shown on her face, because Thomas reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small, leather-bound book. He opened it to a page filled with careful sketches and notes written in a precise hand. "Jackson Malone," he said, pointing to one of the drawings. "Also known as Black Jack. Former Union captain, turned outlaw after the war. Been terrorizing this territory for 3 years now." He flipped to another page. "His gang took a schoolteacher from Santa Fe 2 weeks ago. Description matches you perfectly." Clara stared at the sketch, and the memories came flooding back with sickening clarity. The school board meeting where she'd first seen him, so charming and well-dressed, offering to donate money for new books. The way he'd lingered after the other board members had left, asking questions about her background, her family. She'd thought he was being kind, perhaps even interested in her as a woman. She'd been so terribly wrong. "He wasn't always Black Jack," she whispered. "When I knew him, he was just Jackson Malone, a successful businessman. He came to our school board meetings, made generous donations. Everyone respected him. Thomas's expression grew grim. Con men often start with respectability, makes it easier to get close to their marks. I wasn't his mark. Clara's voice gained strength as the memories crystallized. I was his witness. She told him about that terrible night 2 weeks ago, when she'd returned to the schoolhouse to retrieve some papers she'd forgotten. The building had been dark, but she'd seen lamplight coming from the board meeting room. Thinking someone had left a light burning, she'd gone to extinguish it. Instead, she'd found Jackson Malone standing over the body of Federal Marshal William Hayes, a bloody knife in his hand. Hayes had been investigating him, Clara continued, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. He'd come to the school that afternoon, asking questions about Jackson's donations, where the money really came from. I told him about the meetings, the times Jackson seemed to know things about territorial politics that didn't match his story of being a simple businessman. Thomas nodded slowly. Hayes was a good man, been tracking Blackjack's operation for months. What happened after you saw the body? I ran. The shame in her voice was palpable. I should have stayed, should have fought, but I was so frightened. I made it almost to the door before he caught me. He told me I'd seen too much, that I was going to disappear just like the marshal. That's when his men came, 3 of them, all armed. They tied me up and threw me in the back of a wagon. She closed her eyes, remembering the nightmare journey that had followed. Days of traveling by night, hidden beneath a canvas tarp, given just enough water to keep her alive. The gradual realization that they were taking her deeper into the desert, farther from any hope of rescue. The moment when Black Jack had decided that killing her outright was too merciful, that the desert would be a more fitting executioner. They chained me to that rock at dawn, she said. Black Jack told me it was fitting justice for a woman who couldn't mind her own business. He said the buzzards would pick my bones clean, and no one would ever know what happened to the schoolteacher who saw too much. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, absently stirring the fire with a stick. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. I knew Bill Hayes. We worked together when I was still wearing a badge. He was the kind of lawman who believed in doing right, even when it cost him. You were a lawman? Sheriff of Lincoln County for about 5 years. Lost the job when I wouldn't look the other way for the right price. He gave her a rueful smile. Seems there's a lot of that going around in this territory. Honest folks tend to find themselves out of work or dead. Clara studied his face in the firelight, seeing the lines of weariness that spoke of a man who'd fought too many battles against corruption and lost too many of them. Is that why you're out here alone? In the desert? Among other reasons. Thomas stood and moved to his saddlebags, returning with a small bottle of whiskey and a clean cloth. This might sting, but we need to clean those cuts on your ankles where the chains rubbed. Infection sets in fast in this heat. As he knelt beside her and began gently cleaning her wounds, Clara found herself studying his face more closely. There was something about the careful way he moved, the methodical nature of his care, that spoke of experience with tending to injuries. But there was also a gentleness there, a quality of compassion that seemed at odds with the harsh environment that had shaped him. You didn't have to save me, she said softly. You could have ridden past, avoided the trouble. Thomas paused in his work, meeting her eyes. No, ma'am, I couldn't have. A man's got to live with his choices, and I've made enough bad ones to know the difference. He returned to cleaning her wounds, his touch gentle but thorough. Besides, leaving you to die would have made me no better than Black Jack and his men. As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in Weekshope. Not just for survival, but for the possibility that good people still existed in this harsh world. Thomas Whitmore might be a stranger, might be a man with his own troubled past, but he'd chosen to help her when he could have easily ridden away. What happens now? She asked. Thomas capped the whiskey bottle and sat back on his heels. Now we get you strong enough to travel. Black Jack's going to figure out eventually that you didn't die out there like he planned. When he does, he'll come looking. We need to be long gone before that happens. Where will we go? I've got a few ideas, places where a man can disappear if he needs to. But first, you need rest and food. Tomorrow, we'll start thinking about the future." As night fell over the desert, Clara found herself watching Thomas as he moved around their small camp, checking their supplies, tending to his horse, keeping watch for any sign of pursuit. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to solitude, but she could see the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, alert for danger. She thought about the life she'd left behind in Santa Fe, small schoolhouse where she'd taught children to read, the tidy room she'd rented from Mrs. Place. Henderson, the quiet routine that had given her purpose after so much loss. Her parents had died when she was 22, victims of a cholera outbreak that had swept through their small town in Texas. Teaching had been her way of honoring their memory, of giving something back to the world that had taken so much from her. Now that life was gone, destroyed by one terrible moment of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But as she watched Thomas Whitmore maintain his vigilant watch over their camp, she realized that perhaps destruction could also be a form of liberation. The chains that had bound her in the desert were gone, but so were the invisible chains of her old life, the expectations, the limitations, the safe boundaries that had kept her from truly living. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain. Clara pulled the blanket Thomas had given her closer around her shoulders and closed her eyes, allowing herself to believe that tomorrow might bring something better than mere survival. For the first time in weeks, she fell asleep without fear, trusting in the protection of a man who had chosen mercy over convenience, hope over despair. In the morning, she would begin to discover just how much that choice would cost them both. Clara woke to the sound of Thomas saddling his horse, the leather creaking softly in the pre-dawn darkness. She'd slept better than she had in weeks, but her body still ached from the ordeal. As she sat up, she noticed something that made her heart race. Fresh hoofprints in the sand around their camp. Too many to belong to just Thomas's horse. "They found us," Thomas said without looking up from his work. His voice was calm, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Tracked us during the night, but didn't attack. That means they're being careful, which means they know who I am." Clara's blood ran cold. "How many?" "3, maybe 4. They circled us twice, then rode back the way they came. They're reporting back to Black Jack." He finished cinching his saddle and turned to face her. "We need to move. Now." As they broke camp with practiced efficiency, Clara noticed that Thomas moved differently than he had the night before. Gone was the patient, gentle manner of the caretaker. In its place was something harder, more focused, the bearing of a man who had faced death before and knew its rhythms. "There's something else you need to know," Clara said, as she helped him pack their meager supplies. "About why Black Jack really kept me alive." Thomas paused, his hands stilling on the rope he'd been coiling. "Go on." "I didn't just witness him killing Marshal Hayes. I heard their conversation beforehand. Black Jack was selling information about federal gold shipments to Apache raiders. Hayes had figured it out, had evidence. Black Jack killed him to keep him quiet, but he needed to know what Hayes had already reported back to his superiors. And he thought you might know. He spent 3 days trying to get me to talk. When I couldn't tell him what he wanted to hear, he decided I was more useful as a warning to others." A schoolteacher who disappeared after asking too many questions. Clara's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "But there's more. I do know something he doesn't think I know." Thomas stopped what he was doing entirely, giving her his full attention. "The night before the murder, I was grading papers late in the schoolhouse. I heard voices from the alley behind the building. Black Jack was meeting with someone, a man with a distinctive accent, maybe German or Austrian. They were talking about a silver mine, about how the federal government was moving to seize it from its current owners. Black Jack was being paid to make sure the seizure failed." "Jesus," Thomas breathed. "He's not just robbing gold shipments, he's working with foreign interests to destabilize territorial mining operations. The man gave him a down payment, more gold than I'd ever seen in one place. But that's not the important part. The important part is that I recognized the voice." It was Heinrich Kruger, the territorial mining commissioner. He's supposed to be overseeing the seizure, but he's actually working to prevent it. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications. That's treason. If the federal government is trying to seize that mine, it's probably because they suspect it's being used to fund Confederate sympathizers or foreign agents. Or both. Clara finished packing her few possessions into Thomas's saddlebags. Marshal Hayes wasn't just investigating robbery. He was investigating a conspiracy that goes all the way to the territorial capital. Before Thomas could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the morning air. Not the careful, stealthy approach of scouts, but the thundering charge of men who no longer cared about being detected. Thomas grabbed his rifle and pushed Clara behind a large boulder. "Stay down," he ordered, then peered over the rock at the approaching riders. There were 5 of them, riding hard across the desert floor with their weapons drawn. Clara recognized 2 of them from her captivity: Miguel Santos, Black Jack's lieutenant, and a scarred man they called Cutter, who seemed to enjoy other people's pain. The others were strangers, but their intent was clear. "Thomas Whitmore," Santos called out when they were still 50 yards away. "We know you're there. Send out the girl and we'll make this quick." Thomas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied the terrain, looking for advantages. The boulder they sheltered behind was part of a small rocky outcropping that provided some cover, but they were still exposed on 3 sides. His horse was tethered 20 feet away, too far to reach without exposing themselves to gunfire. "You know I can't do that, Santos," Thomas called back. "Ride away and no one has to die today." Santos laughed, a sound without humor. "You always were too noble for your own good, Sheriff. That's what got you fired, remember? Black Jack says you've cost him enough trouble. Time to pay the bill." The attack came without further warning. Santos and 2 others dismounted and began advancing on foot while the remaining 2 riders circled wide, trying to flank their position. Thomas fired once, dropping the man furthest to the left, then rolled to a new position as return fire chipped fragments from the rock above Clara's head. "Can you shoot?" he asked her during a brief lull. "A little. My father taught me when I was young." Thomas slid her his pistol, a well-maintained Colt 45 that felt heavy in her hands. "Point and squeeze. Don't jerk the trigger. And don't shoot unless you're sure of your target." The battle resumed with renewed intensity. Thomas was a skilled marksman, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Worse, their ammunition was limited, while their attackers seemed to have plenty. Clara found herself pressed against the rock, trying to make herself as small as possible while the sound of gunfire echoed off the desert stones. Then she saw movement to their right, and of the flanking riders had dismounted and was creeping around the rocks, trying to get behind them. Thomas was focused on the frontal assault and hadn't seen the threat. Clara raised the pistol with shaking hands and waited until the man was close enough that she couldn't miss. The shot took him in the chest, and he went down hard. Clara stared in shock at what she'd done, the reality of taking a life hitting her like a physical blow. She'd never killed anyone before, had never even imagined herself capable of such a thing. "Good shot," Thomas said grimly, not taking his eyes off the remaining attackers. "But we're still outnumbered." Santos and his men had taken cover behind some scrub brush and were keeping up a steady rate of fire, pinning them down while ammunition ran low. Clara could see the calculation in Thomas's eyes. They couldn't win this fight, not with their current resources. "There's a gully about 30 yards to our left," Thomas said during another brief pause. "If we can make it there, we can work our way back to higher ground." "What about your horse?" "We'll have to leave him. Can't risk trying to reach him." Thomas checked his rifle, counting the remaining rounds. "On my signal, we run. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just run." Clara nodded, her mouth dry with fear. She'd never been in a gunfight before, had never run for her life across open ground while men tried to kill her. But she'd also never shot a man before today, and she'd managed that. Perhaps she was stronger than she'd thought. "Now," Thomas said. They broke cover together, sprinting across the desert floor as bullets whined past their heads. Clara's legs, still weak from her ordeal, nearly gave out twice, but each time she pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death. Behind them, she could hear Santos shouting orders, organizing pursuit. They reached the gully just as Clara's strength gave out entirely. Thomas caught her as she stumbled, half carrying her down into the rocky depression that cut through the desert like a scar. The walls were only about 6 feet high, but they provided blessed cover from the gunfire. "Keep moving," Thomas urged, helping her along the uneven ground. "This gully runs for about a mile. If we can reach the far end, we can get back to high ground." They moved as quickly as Clara's condition would allow, Thomas supporting her weight while keeping watch for pursuit. Behind them, they could hear Santos and his men arguing about whether to follow them into the gully or try to cut them off at the far end. "They'll split up," Thomas predicted. "Some will follow us, others will ride ahead. We need to be ready for both." Halfway through the gully, they found what Thomas had been hoping for, a narrow side passage that led up and out of the main channel. It was barely wide enough for one person, but it would get them out of the trap they were in. "Up," Thomas said, boosting Clara ahead of him. "Quickly now." They climbed in silence, their hands and knees scraped raw by the rough stone. Clara's teaching certificate, blood-stained and torn, fell from her pocket and fluttered away in the desert wind. She watched it go with a mixture of sadness and relief that life was truly over now, burned away by violence and the harsh realities of survival. At the top of the passage, they found themselves on a rocky mesa that overlooked the desert in all directions. In the distance, Clara could see dust clouds that marked the approach of more riders. Black Jack wasn't taking any chances. He'd sent his entire gang. "We can't outrun them on foot," Thomas said, studying the approaching dust. "And we can't fight them all." He turned to Clara, his expression grave. "There's something I need to tell you, about why they're so determined to kill us both." Clara braced herself for whatever revelation was coming. "I'm not just a former sheriff," Thomas continued. "I'm the man who killed Black Jack's brother during a bank robbery 5 years ago. He's been hunting me ever since, waiting for the right moment to take his revenge. By saving you, I've given him the perfect opportunity." The weight of this knowledge settled on Clara like a stone. She wasn't just a witness to murder, she was bait in a trap that had been years in the making. But instead of feeling betrayed, she found herself angry. Angry at Black Jack for his cruelty, angry at the corruption that had driven good men like Thomas from their posts, angry at a world that seemed determined to crush anyone who tried to do right. "Then we make sure he doesn't get what he wants," she said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "We survive this, and we make him pay for what he's done." Thomas looked at her with something like admiration. "You're stronger than you know, Clara Martinez. But strength alone won't be enough. We need a plan, and we need help." In the distance, the dust clouds were getting closer, and Clara could make out individual riders now. Black Jack's gang was converging on their position from multiple directions, cutting off any hope of escape. "I know someone who might help us," Thomas said after a moment. "An old friend who owes me a favor. But reaching him means crossing 40 miles of desert with every outlaw in the territory hunting us." Clara looked out at the vast expanse of sand and stone, then back at Thomas. "Then we'd better get started." The real fight was just beginning. They traveled by moonlight, moving like ghosts across the desert floor. Thomas had fashioned makeshift shoes for Clara from strips of leather cut from his saddlebags, but her feet were still raw and bleeding by the time they stopped to rest just before dawn. They'd covered perhaps 8 miles, but at the cost of Clara's remaining strength. "We can't keep this pace," Thomas said, examining her feet by the light of a carefully shielded candle. "You need proper rest, and we need water. There's a settlement about 2 miles northeast San Miguel. It's not much, just a few families and a trading post, but they might help us." Clara winced as he cleaned a particularly deep cut on her heel. What if Black Jack's men are already there? "It's possible, but we don't have much choice. You're in no condition to cross the desert on foot, and I can't carry you the whole way." Thomas capped his water bottle, now nearly empty. Besides, there's something else we need to consider. If Black Jack is really working with foreign agents, then there are people in Santa Fe who need to know about it. Marshal Hayes is dead. Who else would believe us? Judge Samuel Morrison. He's been fighting corruption in the territorial government for years. If anyone would listen to our story and act on it, it would be him. Thomas helped Clara to her feet, supporting her weight as they prepared to move again. But first, we need to survive long enough to reach him. The settlement of San Miguel consisted of a dozen adobe buildings clustered around a small well. As they approached, Clara could see smoke rising from several chimneys, and the sound of children's voices carried on the morning air. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic, exactly the kind of place that would suffer terribly if outlaws decided to use it as a battlefield. There, Thomas pointed to a modest building with a cross mounted above the door. Father Martinez runs a small mission there. He's a good man, and he won't turn away people in need. As they walked toward the mission, Clara noticed Thomas's hand never strayed far from his gun. Despite the peaceful appearance of the settlement, he remained alert for trouble. That caution proved justified when they rounded the corner of the church and found themselves face to face with a family under siege. 3 men on horseback had surrounded a small adobe house. One held a rope around the neck of a middle-aged Mexican man, while another aimed a rifle at a woman and 2 small children huddled in the doorway. The third man, who appeared to be their leader, was shouting demands in broken Spanish. "Where is he?" the leader demanded. "We know he came through here, the schoolteacher and the man who killed Santos." Clara's blood ran cold. They'd tracked them here, but somehow missed their actual presence. The family was being terrorized because of them. "We don't know anything about a schoolteacher," the man with the rope around his neck gasped. "Please, my children." "Your children will be fine if you tell us what we want to know," the leader said. "But if you're lying to us, well, accidents happen." Thomas moved so quickly that Clara almost missed it. One moment he was beside her, the next he was behind the leader, his knife at the man's throat. The transformation was startling. Gone was the gentle protector who had tended her wounds. In his place was someone harder, more dangerous. "Let him go," Thomas said quietly. "Now." The man with the rifle started to swing his weapon toward Thomas, but froze when he saw the deputy's star pinned to Thomas's vest. Clara blinked in surprise as she hadn't seen him put it on. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff," the leader said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Black Jack's got $1,000 on your head, dead or alive. And you're about to find out why I'm still breathing while better men than you are feeding the worms," Thomas replied. "Your friend there is going to lower his rifle real slow, and you're going to tell your man to release that rope. Then you're all going to ride out of here and forget you ever saw this place." "You can't fight all of us," the leader protested. "Maybe not, but I can damn sure kill you before your friends know what happened. Question is, are you worth dying for a bounty you'll never collect?" The tension stretched taut for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then the man with the rifle slowly lowered his weapon, and the one holding the rope loosened it enough for the Mexican man to breathe freely. "This isn't over," the leader said as Thomas stepped back, but the threat sounded hollow. "Yes, it is," Thomas replied, "and if I see any of you within 50 miles of this settlement again, I'll consider it a personal insult." The 3 men mounted their horses and rode away, but Clara could see they were angry rather than defeated. They'd be back, probably with reinforcements. "You saved our lives," the Mexican man said, rubbing his throat where the rope had left marks. "How can we repay you?" "By forgetting we were ever here," Thomas said. "Those men will be back, and when they come, you need to be able to tell them honestly that you haven't seen us." The man nodded, understanding. "There is a placia cave in the hills about 3 miles south. My grandfather used to hide there during the Apache Wars. It has water and shelter. You could rest there safely." "Thank you," Clara said, stepping forward. "I'm sorry we brought trouble to your home." "Trouble was already coming," the man replied. "At least now we know to be ready for it." As they prepared to leave, the woman from the doorway approached Clara. She was about 40, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a life of hard work. "You are the school teacher," she said quietly. "My sister's children attend school in Santa Fe. They spoke of a Señorita Martinez who was kind to them. Clara nodded, unsure what to say. My name is Rosa Chavez. Those men, they are looking for you because you saw something, yes? Something that frightened them. Yes. Rosa studied her for a moment, then pressed something into Clara's hand, a small wooden cross, worn smooth by years of handling. My grandmother gave this to me when I was your age. She said it would protect me from evil men. Perhaps it will do the same for you. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. I can't take this. It's too precious. That is why you must take it. Evil men like those who just left, they think they can frighten us into silence. But there are more of us than there are of them. You must remember that. As they made their way toward the hills, Clara found herself thinking about Rosa's words. She'd spent so much time focused on her own fear, her own survival, that she'd forgotten about the bigger picture. Black Jack wasn't just threatening her, he was threatening everyone who might stand up to him. The cave Rosa's husband had told them about was more than just a hiding place. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, there were people willing to help, willing to stand up for what was right. The wooden cross in Clara's pocket felt warm against her fingers, a tangible connection to that truth. You did well back there, she told Thomas, as they climbed the rocky path. The way you handled those men, it was like watching a different person. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. That's because it was a different person. The man who wore this badge for 5 years, who thought he could make a difference through law and order. I put it away when I lost faith in the system, but seeing those children in danger, he shook his head. Some things are worth fighting for, even if the fight seems hopeless. They reached the cave as the sun was reaching its zenith. It was cool inside, with a small spring that provided fresh water and natural shelves where they could rest. Clara collapsed gratefully onto a bed of soft sand, her body finally able to acknowledge the exhaustion that had been building for days. Rest now, Thomas said, settling down near the cave entrance where he could watch for approaching riders. We'll move again tonight. As Clara drifted off to sleep, she heard Thomas cleaning his weapons, the soft sound of metal on metal strangely comforting. She dreamed of her school children, of Rosa's grandmother, of all the people who depended on someone being willing to stand up to men like Black Jack. When she woke, the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Thomas was still at his post, but now he was writing in a small notebook, his handwriting careful and precise. What are you working on? She asked. A letter to Judge Morrison. If something happens to us, someone needs to know what we've learned about Black Jack and his connections. He looked up from his writing. I'm also making a map of their camps, their routes, their habits, everything I've observed over the years. Clara sat up, her body protesting but stronger than it had been that morning. You think we're going to die, don't you? I think we're going to fight. And when people fight men like Black Jack, sometimes they don't survive. Thomas capped his pen and put the notebook away. But sometimes they do. And sometimes, even when they don't, their fight makes it possible for others to finish what they started. Outside the cave, they could hear the sound of distant gunfire, not close enough to be immediate danger, but close enough to remind them that they were still being hunted. Those men from the settlement, Clara said. They'll keep looking for us. Probably. But they're also down to 2 men now, and they know I'm armed and dangerous. They'll be more cautious, which gives us an advantage. Clara fingered the wooden cross in her pocket, thinking about Rosa's words. Thomas, when this is over, if we survive, what will you do? He considered the question seriously. I suppose I'll go back to trying to make a difference, maybe not as a sheriff, but in whatever way I can. What about you? I used to think I wanted to go back to teaching, but now, she paused, surprised by her own thoughts. Now I think I want to do something more direct. Something that helps people fight back against men like Black Jack. Thomas smiled, and for a moment he looked like the gentleman who had tended her wounds rather than the dangerous one who had faced down 3 armed men. You know, there's always a need for people who can read and write, who can help others understand their rights, a different kind of teaching, but teaching nonetheless. As night fell, they prepared to leave the cave and continue their journey. Clara felt different than she had when they'd arrived, stronger, more certain of her purpose. The wooden cross in her pocket was a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight, that there were others who believed in standing up to evil. But first, they had to survive the desert and the men who were hunting them through it. The abandoned mission of San Teodoro appeared in the pre-dawn darkness like a mirage of hope. Its adobe walls were crumbling, and the wooden cross atop the bell tower had fallen years ago. But to Clara and Thomas, it represented the possibility of sanctuary. They'd walked through the night, following a dry riverbed that Thomas hoped would mask their tracks from pursuing riders. Clara's feet were beyond pain now, wrapped in strips torn from Thomas's spare shirt and stained with blood that had dried to a rusty brown. She moved with the mechanical determination of someone who had discovered reserves of strength she never knew existed. The wooden cross Rosa had given her remained clutched in her left hand, worn smooth by her constant touch. "We'll rest here until evening," Thomas said, examining the mission's interior by the light of a small candle. "The walls are thick enough to hide a fire, and there's still a well in the courtyard." Clara sank onto a wooden pew, one of the few pieces of furniture that remained intact. The mission felt peaceful despite its decay, as if the prayers once offered here had somehow soaked into the very stones. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to be safe, to wake up in her small room in Santa Fe without fear. "This place has seen its share of suffering," Thomas said, settling beside her on the pew. "The Franciscans built it in 1847, served the local Apache and Mexican families for about 10 years before the Apache Wars drove everyone away." Clara opened her eyes and looked around the small chapel. On the wall behind where the altar had once stood, she could see the faded remnants of painted saints, their faces worn away by time and weather, but their hands still raised in blessing. "How do you know so much about it?" "I helped evacuate the last families when I was a deputy. That was 15 years ago, but I remember the priest Father Jose. He didn't want to leave, said his flock needed him. Took 3 of us to convince him that staying meant dying." Thomas rose and moved to a small alcove where a statue of the Virgin Mary still stood. Her blue robes faded, but her expression of compassion unchanged. From his vest pocket, he withdrew his mother's rosary, the same one Clara had noticed him carrying, but had been too polite to ask about. "My wife Elena was buried with her rosary," he said quietly. "This one belonged to my mother. She gave it to me when I left home to become a lawman, said it would keep me on the right path." He smiled sadly. "She died before she could see how wrong she was about that." Clara studied his profile in the candlelight, seeing the grief that he carried like a physical weight. "What happened to your wife?" "Childbirth. The baby too, a boy we'd planned to name Samuel after my father." Thomas's voice grew thick with emotion. "The doctor said there were complications, things that might have been prevented if we'd been closer to a real hospital. But Elena loved our little ranch, didn't want to move to town, even when she started showing." He was quiet for a long moment, absently fingering the rosary beads. "She died holding my hand, telling me not to blame myself. But I did anyway. If I'd been a better husband, a better provider, maybe I could have given her the care she needed." Clara felt her heart ache for him. She'd lost her parents to disease, but that had been quick, unexpected. Thomas had watched his wife and unborn child slip away slowly, helplessly. "Is that why you became so dedicated to law enforcement? To honor her memory?" "Maybe. Or maybe I just needed something to do with the anger." He returned the rosary to his pocket and sat back down beside her. "After Elena died, I threw myself into the job. Worked longer hours, took bigger risks, pursued cases that other sheriffs wouldn't touch. I told myself it was about justice, but really, it was about punishing myself. And when you lost the job, I lost my purpose along with it. Spent 2 years drinking and drifting, telling myself that the world was too corrupt to save. Then I met Marshall Hayes, and he reminded me that even if the system is broken, individual choices still matter." Clara fingered Rosa's wooden cross, thinking about individual choices and their consequences. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about fighting back. Before all this happened, I thought teaching was enough, that educating children was my way of making the world better. It is a way of making the world better. But it's not enough, is it? Not when men like Black Jack can destroy everything good people try to build. She turned to face him directly. I killed a man yesterday, Thomas. Shot him dead without hesitation. A week ago, I couldn't have imagined myself capable of such a thing. You did what you had to do to survive. No, it was more than that. I wanted to kill him. When I saw him trying to hurt you, trying to destroy our chance of escape, I felt something I'd never felt before. Not just anger, but she searched for the right word. Righteous fury, I suppose. The same feeling I imagine you had when you put on that badge to protect those children. Thomas nodded slowly. The desire to protect the innocent can be a powerful force, but it can also be dangerous if it's not tempered with wisdom. Teach me, Clara said suddenly. Teach me to shoot properly, to fight, to protect myself and others. I don't want to be helpless anymore. Thomas studied her face in the candlelight. Are you sure? Once you start down that path, it changes you. There's no going back to being the person you were before. That person is already gone. She died in the desert with those chains. Clara's voice was steady, certain. I want to become someone who can stand up to men like Black Jack, someone who can protect people like Rose's family. For the next several hours, as the sun climbed toward its zenith outside the mission walls, Thomas began Clara's education in the practical arts of survival and self-defense. He showed her how to properly clean and load a pistol, how to sight down the barrel and compensate for distance and wind. Her hands, which had once held only chalk and books, learned the weight and balance of weapons. Don't think of it as learning to kill, Thomas advised as she practiced her stance. Think of it as learning to protect. The mindset matters more than the skill, because it's what will give you the strength to act when the moment comes. They used empty bottles they found in the mission's storage room for target practice, muffling the sound with thick adobe walls. Clara's first shots went wide, but she improved quickly. Her schoolteacher's precision served her well. She had steady hands and the patience to practice the same motion over and over until it became natural. You're a natural, Thomas said after she'd shattered 3 bottles in a row. Better than most deputies I've trained. Clara felt a flush of pride, followed immediately by a pang of sadness. How strange that her greatest aptitude outside of teaching should be for something so violent. But then she thought of the children she'd taught, of Rosa's family, of all the innocent people who suffered because no one was strong enough to protect them. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas shared other skill show to move quietly across different types of terrain, how to read tracks and signs of pursuit, how to find water and shelter in the desert. Clara absorbed it all with the same intensity she'd once brought to lesson planning, understanding that her life might depend on remembering these details. There's something else you need to understand, Thomas said as they shared a sparse meal of jerky and water. What we're doing, standing up to Black Jack and his organization, it's not just about revenge or even justice, it's about hope. Hope. People like Rosa and her family, they need to believe that good can triumph over evil. When they see corrupt lawmen and crooked officials, when they watch outlaws terrorize their communities without consequence, they start to lose faith in the possibility of justice. But when they see someone willing to fight back, to risk everything for what's right, that gives them hope. Clara thought about her former students, about their bright faces turned toward her as she taught them to read. And hope makes them stronger. Exactly. A community with hope is a community that can resist corruption, that can build something better. But hope requires examples, people willing to stand up even when the odds are against them. As evening approached and they prepared to continue their journey, Clara felt the truth of Thomas's words settling into her bones. She was no longer just a witness to Black Jack's crimes or a victim of his cruelty. She was choosing to become something more, a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope for others who felt powerless against corruption and violence. The wooden cross in her pocket had grown warm from her touch, and she could almost feel Rosa's grandmother's strength flowing through it. 3 generations of women who had faced evil and refused to be broken by it. Clara was part of that legacy now, part of a tradition of courage that stretched back through time. "Where are we headed?" she asked, as Thomas extinguished their small fire. "North, toward Las Cruces. Judge Morrison should be there for the territorial court session. If we can reach him, we can turn the tide against Black Jack's organization. And if we can't reach him—" Thomas checked his weapons one final time, then looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "Then we'll find another way. That's what hope means, never giving up, no matter how dark things get." As they stepped out into the desert night, Clara felt different than she had when they'd arrived at the mission. She was still afraid. A fool wouldn't be afraid with Black Jack's men hunting them, but the fear no longer paralyzed her. Instead, it sharpened her focus, reminded her of what was at stake. Behind them, the ruined mission stood silent in the moonlight, its broken walls a testament to the persistence of faith even in the face of destruction. Ahead lay the desert and all its dangers, but also the possibility of justice, of hope fulfilled. Clara Martinez was no longer running from her past. She was running toward her future. The wanted poster bore a crude but recognizable likeness of Jackson Malone's face, but the name beneath it read Black Jack Malone, and the description told a story Clara had never heard. According to the yellowed paper tacked to the wall of Murphy's trading post, Black Jack had been Captain Jackson Malone of the 7th New Mexico Volunteer Infantry during the war, decorated for valor at the Battle of Glorieta Pass. Says here he saved an entire company from Confederate artillery. Clara read quietly, studying the poster while Thomas negotiated with the proprietor for supplies. Received a commendation from General Canby himself. The transformation from war hero to outlaw was a story she'd heard too many times since the war's end. Good men broken by what they'd seen and done, unable to find their place in a world that demanded they pretend the killing had never happened. But understanding Black Jack's fall from grace didn't excuse his crimes or make him less dangerous. "Mr. Murphy," Thomas called to the trading post owner, "this poster, how long has it been up?" The elderly man squinted at the wall through wire-rimmed spectacles. "Oh, that old thing. Must be 4, 5 years now. Nobody's seen hide nor hair of Black Jack around these parts for months. Some say he moved his operation south, toward the border." Clara and Thomas exchanged glances. They knew better. Black Jack hadn't moved south. He'd simply gotten better at hiding his activities, using his war record and reputation to maintain a facade of respectability while building his criminal empire. "We'll take the usual supplies," Thomas said, counting out coins from his dwindling funds. "Salt pork, hardtack, coffee if you have it, and ammunition for a .45 and a Winchester." Murphy gathered their purchases, his movements slow but efficient. "You folks heading somewhere particular? Only ask because there's been some unsavory characters riding through lately. Might want to avoid the main roads for a spell." "Just passing through," Thomas replied. "Appreciate the warning." As they loaded their supplies into makeshift packs, Clara noticed another poster on the wall, this one newer, with her own face staring back at her. The resemblance was accurate enough to be concerning, and the reward offered was substantial, $500 for information leading to the capture of Clara Martinez, wanted for questioning in connection with the murder of Federal Marshal William Hayes. "They're saying I killed him," she whispered to Thomas. "They're making me the murderer." Thomas examined the poster more closely. "Look at the bottom, who issued it." Clara read the fine print. "By order of Heinrich Kruger, Territorial Mining Commissioner, acting in cooperation with territorial law enforcement." "Kruger," Thomas said grimly. "The same man you heard talking with Black Jack about the silver mine. He's using his official position to make you look like the criminal while protecting the real killer." The implications were staggering. If Kruger could issue wanted posters in his official capacity, how many other aspects of territorial law enforcement were under his control? How deeply did the corruption run? "We need to be even more careful," Thomas continued as they prepared to leave the trading post. "Every lawman in the territory will be looking for you now, and most of them will believe they're hunting a genuine fugitive." They left Murphy's establishment by the back door, avoiding the main street where too many eyes might see and remember them. The sun was high and hot, and Clara could feel sweat beginning to bead on her forehead despite the early hour. The desert was unforgiving, but she was learning to respect its harsh beauty rather than fear it. 2 miles outside the settlement, they encountered their first test of the new reality. A rider appeared on the trail ahead, a territorial deputy by his badge and bearing, heading towards town with obvious purpose. There was no way to avoid him without arousing suspicion. "Let me do the talking," Thomas murmured. "Keep your head down and follow my lead." The deputy was young, maybe 25, with the eager expression of someone still convinced that law enforcement was about protecting the innocent. He raised his hand in greeting as they approached. "Morning, folks," the deputy called. "Deputy Warren, out of Las Cruces. You wouldn't happen to have seen anything unusual on the trail. We're looking for a dangerous fugitive woman named Clara Martinez, wanted for murder." Thomas touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Morning, deputy. Name's Tom Whitmore, and this here's my wife, Sarah. We're heading to Las Cruces to visit her sister. Haven't seen anyone matching that description, but we'll keep our eyes open." Clara kept her head bowed, playing the part of a modest frontier wife. The deception felt wrong. She'd been raised to respect authority and tell the truth, but she understood the necessity. This young deputy was probably honest, but he was working with information that had been deliberately falsified. "Much obliged," Deputy Warren said. "This Martinez woman is considered armed and extremely dangerous. If you do see her, don't approach just. Get word to the nearest law office. There's a substantial reward for information leading to her capture." "We'll remember that," Thomas assured him. "Appreciate the warning." As the deputy rode on toward town, Clara felt the weight of being hunted by the very people who should have been protecting her. The poster had transformed her from victim to villain, from witness to wanted criminal. It was a masterful piece of manipulation, and she could see Black Jack's hand in every detail. "How many more like him?" she asked Thomas once the deputy was out of earshot. "Too many. Most territorial lawmen are honest, but they're working with information controlled by men like Kruger. They think they're upholding justice when they're actually serving corruption." They walked in silence for several miles, each lost in their own thoughts. Clara found herself thinking about the young deputy, about his obvious dedication to his job. In another life, he might have been someone she could trust, someone who would listen to her story and act on it. But Black Jack's manipulation had poisoned even that possibility. "There has to be someone," she said finally. "Someone in authority who can't be bought or fooled." "Judge Morrison," Thomas replied without hesitation. "He's been fighting corruption since before the war. If anyone can see through Kruger's lies, it's him. And if we can't reach him—" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering possibilities. "Then we find another way. There are still good people in positions of power: federal marshals, territorial administrators, military commanders. The trick is finding them before the corrupt ones find us." As they crested a small hill, Clara caught sight of something that made her heart sink. A dust cloud on the horizon, moving in their direction. Multiple riders, traveling fast, and from the direction they'd come, it was likely they'd spoken with Deputy Warren. "Company," she said, pointing toward the approaching dust. Thomas shaded his eyes with his hand, studying the distant riders. 4, maybe 5 of them, moving too fast to be casual travelers. They had perhaps 10 minutes before the riders reached their position. The terrain offered little concealment, mostly flat desert with scattered brush and the occasional boulder. Thomas quickly scanned their options. "There," he said, pointing to a dry wash that cut across the landscape about a quarter-mile to their left. "If we can reach it before they spot us, we can follow it north and lose them in the broken country." They ran, not the desperate flight of their earlier escapes, but the measured pace of people who had learned to conserve their strength for when it mattered most. Clara's feet, toughened by days of desert travel, carried her steadily across the rough ground. They reached the wash just as the riders topped the hill behind them. Clara pressed herself against the sandy bank, listening to the thunder of hoofbeats passing overhead. Through a gap in the brush, she caught a glimpse of their pursuers, 5 men, wearing the mixed garb of outlaws and corrupt lawmen, led by a figure she recognized with a chill of fear. Miguel Santos, Black Jack's lieutenant, the man they'd fought at their first camp. His face bore fresh scars from that encounter, and his expression promised retribution. Beside him rode Deputy Warren, the young lawman who had seemed so honest and dedicated just an hour before. "Santos has turned him," Thomas whispered. "Probably told him some story about us being the criminals, promised him a share of the reward money." Clara felt a surge of anger at the corruption that could twist even well-meaning people into instruments of evil. But she also felt something else, growing determination to expose the truth, to find a way to show people like Deputy Warren what they were really fighting for. The riders passed overhead, following the main trail toward Las Cruces. Clara and Thomas waited in the wash until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, then began working their way north through the maze of smaller gullies and arroyos that carved the desert landscape. "We need to change our approach," Thomas said as they navigated the broken terrain. "Going straight to Las Cruces is too dangerous now. Santos knows that's where we're headed." "What do you suggest?" "There's an old mining camp about 20 miles northeast of here, Silver Creek. It's mostly abandoned now, but Judge Morrison sometimes holds court there for the few remaining residents. If we can reach it, we might be able to get a message to him without walking into a trap." Clara nodded, though the prospect of another long journey across hostile terrain was daunting. But they'd come too far to give up now, and too many people were counting on them to expose the truth about Black Jack's organization. As they climbed out of the wash and oriented themselves toward Silver Creek, Clara fingered the wooden cross in her pocket and thought about Rosa's words. "There are more of us than there are of them." It was true, she realized. For every corrupt official like Kruger, for every outlaw like Black Jack, there were dozens of honest people like Deputy Warren who simply needed to know the truth. The challenge was finding a way to tell them. The hidden cache lay buried beneath a distinctive rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant, 2 boulders balanced against each other, with a gap between them just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Thomas had led them here, after 2 days of careful travel, moving only at night and hiding during the day to avoid Santos and his expanding search parties. "I put this together 3 years ago," Thomas explained as he carefully moved rocks and brushed away from a concealed wooden crate. "Back when I still thought I might return to law enforcement someday." Inside the cache was a small arsenal, 2 Winchester rifles, ammunition, a pair of Colt revolvers, and supplies that could sustain them for weeks. But it was the other items that caught Clara's attention: maps marked with locations and dates, a leather-bound journal filled with observations, and a collection of official documents that Thomas had apparently saved from his time as sheriff. "You've been planning this," she said, not quite a question. "Not this specifically, but I knew that someday I'd have to make a choice: keep running from my past, or stand up and fight for what's right." Thomas lifted one of the rifles, checking its action with practiced ease. "When I found you in that desert, the choice was made for me." Clara picked up the journal, flipping through pages of meticulous notes about outlaw movements, corrupt officials, and patterns of criminal activity. The detail was extraordinary. Thomas had been building a case against Black Jack's organization for years, even while telling himself he'd given up on justice. "This is enough evidence to bring down half the territorial government," she said, reading an entry about bribes paid to mining officials. "Evidence, yes, but not proof that would stand up in court. Most of it's observational, circumstantial. We need something more concrete: documents, witnesses, physical evidence of the conspiracy." As Clara continued reading, she began to understand the scope of Black Jack's operation. It wasn't just robbery and murder, it was a systematic effort to control territorial politics, mining rights, and law enforcement. The silver mine she'd heard Kruger discussing was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. "Look at this," she said, pointing to an entry from 6 months earlier. "Black Jack's men attacked a federal survey team near the Pecos River. The surveyors were mapping potential railroad routes." Thomas looked over her shoulder at the journal. "I remember that incident. 3 surveyors killed, their equipment destroyed. The territorial government blamed it on Apache raiders, but I never believed that story. What if it wasn't about hiding silver mines? Clara said, her mind racing. What if it was about controlling where the railroad gets built? Think about how much money would be involved in railroad contracts, land speculation, mining rights along the proposed routes. The implications were staggering. If Blackjack's organization could influence where the railroad was built, they could make fortunes buying up worthless land that would suddenly become valuable. They could also ensure that mines owned by their allies got access to transportation while competitors were left isolated. That would explain the foreign connection, Thomas said slowly. European investors have been pouring money into American railroad development. If someone could guarantee them inside information about routes and contracts, they'd pay handsomely for it. Clara closed the journal, her expression grim. We're not just dealing with a gang of outlaws. We're dealing with a conspiracy that could affect the entire territory's development. Thomas began distributing weapons and ammunition, his movements efficient and methodical. All the more reason to get this information to Judge Morrison. He has connections in Washington federal officials who could act on evidence of this scope. Clara hefted one of the revolvers, feeling its weight in her hand. After days of practice, the weapon no longer felt foreign to her. She checked the cylinder, loaded it properly, and secured it in the holster Thomas had provided. The transformation from schoolteacher to armed fugitive was complete, but she no longer mourned the woman she'd been. That woman couldn't have survived what they'd faced, couldn't have done what still needed to be done. There's something else in here, Thomas said, reaching deeper into the cache. He withdrew a small metal box, which he opened to reveal a collection of badges and official documents. My commission papers, letters of recommendation, testimony from cases I'd worked. If we can reach someone in federal authority, these might help establish my credibility. Among the papers was something that made Clara's breath catch, a letter of commendation from Federal Marshal William Hayes, praising Thomas's integrity and dedication to justice. The irony was bitter. Hayes had been murdered by the same man Thomas was now hunting, and his words of praise might be the key to bringing that murderer to justice. Hayes believed in you, she said, showing him the letter. Thomas read it quietly, his jaw tightening with emotion. He was a good man, deserved better than what Blackjack gave him. They spent the rest of the morning organizing their supplies and planning their approach to Silver Creek. The abandoned mining camp was still 20 miles away, across terrain that would be difficult to traverse while avoiding patrols. But Thomas had studied the area extensively, and he knew routes that would keep them away from the main trails. There's something I need to teach you, he said as they prepared to leave the cache. Something I should have taught you days ago. Clara looked up from checking her pack. What? How to kill quietly. Thomas's expression was deadly serious. If we're captured, they won't just kill us. They'll torture us first, try to find out what we know and who we've told. We can't let that happen. The lesson that followed was grim, but necessary. Thomas showed her how to approach a sentry silently, where to strike for maximum effect, how to use a knife when a gun would make too much noise. Clara's hands shook the first time she practiced the motions, but she forced herself to learn. She'd already killed one man to protect Thomas, had to be prepared to do it again if necessary. The key is not to think of them as people, Thomas advised as she practiced. Think of them as obstacles between you and the innocent people you're trying to protect. Focus on the mission, not the individual. Clara nodded, though the advice sat uneasily with her. She'd been raised to see the humanity in everyone, to believe in redemption and second chances. But she was learning that some people chose to forfeit their humanity, and when they did, others had to be strong enough to stop them. As they set out from the cache, traveling by daylight for the first time in days, Clara felt the weight of the weapons she carried and the knowledge she'd gained. They were no longer just running from Blackjack's men, they were actively hunting them, gathering intelligence, preparing for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the entire territory. The sun was brutal, but Clara had learned to move with the desert's rhythms, to conserve water and energy, to find shade where none seemed to exist. Her feet, once soft and pampered, now carried her steadily across the roughest terrain. Her hands, once smooth from a life of indoor work, were calloused from handling weapons and tools. "You've changed," Thomas observed as they paused to rest in the shade of a large boulder. "So have you. When I first saw you, you seemed like a man running from something. Now you're running toward it." Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Maybe we're both becoming who we were always meant to be." As they resumed their journey, Clara thought about his words. Maybe he was right. Maybe the gentle schoolteacher had always carried within her the seed of the fighter she'd become. Maybe Thomas's exile in the desert had been preparation for this moment, when his skills and knowledge would be needed to serve justice. In the distance, she could see the mountains that surrounded Silver Creek, their peaks stark against the desert sky. Somewhere in those mountains, Judge Morrison might be holding court, dispensing justice to the few remaining residents of the mining camp. If they could reach him, if they could convince him to listen, they might finally have a chance to turn the tide against Black Jack's organization. But first, they had to survive the journey, and as Clara scanned the horizon for signs of pursuit, she knew that their enemies were closer than ever, more desperate than ever, and more dangerous than ever. The final confrontation was coming, and everything they'd learned, everything they'd endured, would be tested in the crucible of that approaching battle. The letter was hidden in the lining of Clara's torn dress, sewn there so carefully that even she had forgotten it existed, until the fabric finally gave way during their climb up the mountain trail. As the small oilskin packet fell to the ground, Thomas stooped to retrieve it, his expression curious. "What's this?" he asked, holding up the waterproof pouch. Clara's face went pale as memory rushed back. "Two'd forgotten. Marshal Hayes gave it to me the day before he was murdered. He said it was insurance, something to keep me safe if anything happened to him." With trembling fingers, she unwrapped the oilskin to reveal a folded document bearing an official federal seal. As she read the contents, her legs nearly gave out beneath her. Thomas caught her arm, steadying her as she struggled to process what she was seeing. "Clara, what does it say?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been fear. "It's my commission. Thomas, I'm a federal agent. I have been for 6 months." The words hung in the desert air like a thunderclap. Thomas stared at her, his expression cycling through disbelief, betrayal, and finally a kind of wounded understanding. "You've been lying to me," he said quietly. "This whole time, you've been lying." "No!" Clara's voice was desperate. "I mean, yes, but not the way you think. I forgot, Thomas. The trauma, the fear when Black Jack captured me, when they chained me in that desert, something in my mind just blocked it out. It's only now, seeing this document, that I remember." She sank down onto a nearby boulder, the letter clutched in her hands as memories came flooding back. "Marshal Hayes recruited me 3 months before his death. The federal government suspected corruption in the territorial administration, but they needed someone who could get close to local officials without arousing suspicion. A schoolteacher," Thomas said, his voice flat. "Someone respectable, trusted, who attended social functions and heard gossip." Clara's voice grew stronger as the memories solidified. "My job was to listen, to watch, to report back on anything suspicious. Hayes was my contact." Thomas turned away from her, staring out at the desert landscape they'd crossed together. "What else have you forgotten? What else have you been hiding from me?" "Nothing." Clara stood, moving toward him. "Thomas, you have to believe me. The commission, the mission, it all came back when I saw the letter. But everything else I've told you is true. My capture, what I witnessed, my feelings for." She stopped herself, realizing she'd been about to confess something that might not be welcome under the circumstances. "Your feelings for what?" Thomas asked, still not looking at her. "For you," she said simply. "Those aren't part of any mission. They're real." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation and its implications. When he finally turned back to her, his expression was guarded, but no longer hostile. "What exactly was your mission? What were you supposed to discover?" Clara unfolded the letter completely, reading through the detailed instructions she'd somehow suppressed from her memory. I was investigating the Territorial Mining Commission, specifically Heinrich Kruger's activities. The federal government suspected he was selling information about mine surveys and mineral rights to foreign investors. Foreign investors, Thomas repeated, like the man you heard talking with Black Jack. It's all connected. Kruger was feeding information to European cartels who were buying up mining claims based on insider knowledge. But they needed muscle to protect their investments, to drive off legitimate claimants and eliminate federal investigators. Enter Black Jack Malone. Clara nodded, the full scope of the conspiracy finally becoming clear. Hayes must have figured it out. That's why he was at the school that Ninth was meeting me to get my latest report. But Black Jack was already suspicious, already watching. Thomas sat down beside her on the boulder, his anger giving way to professional interest. If you're a federal agent, then your testimony would carry more weight with authorities. Judge Morrison would have to listen to you. But it also means Black Jack knows who I really am now. He's not just trying to kill a witness, he's trying to kill a federal operative. That makes this a matter of national security. The implications were staggering. If foreign cartels were manipulating American territorial development, if they were using outlaws to eliminate federal agents, then the conspiracy reached far beyond simple robbery and murder. It was an act of war, conducted through surrogates and hidden behind layers of corruption. There's something else, Clara said, reading further into the document. Other agents. I wasn't working alone. Thomas leaned closer, reading over her shoulder. Agent Sarah Mitchell, operating undercover as a telegraph operator in Las Cruces. Agent David Foster, posing as a mining engineer in Silver Creek. If they're still alive, still in position, we might have allies we didn't know about. Clara folded the letter carefully, her mind racing with possibilities. But we also might have exposed them by heading to those locations. Or they might have intelligence we need. Thomas stood, beginning to pace as he thought through the tactical implications. If Foster is really in Silver Creek, he might know whether Judge Morrison is actually there, or if it's a trap. Clara watched him pace, seeing the lawman he'd once been emerging more clearly. The revelation of her true identity seemed to have awakened something in him, sense of purpose that went beyond personal justice. You're not angry with me anymore, she observed. Thomas paused in his pacing. I'm angry that you didn't trust me with the truth from the beginning. But I understand why you couldn't remember, and I understand why the mission was classified. He looked at her directly. What I need to know now is whether your feelings for me are part of the cover or something real. Clara stood and moved closer to him, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his grey eyes. Federal agents don't seduce former sheriffs as part of their cover, Thomas. What I feel for you happened despite the mission, not because of it. Thomas studied her face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because when he spoke again, his voice was gentler. I believe you, but this changes everything, Clara. If you're a federal agent, then we're not just running from outlaws anymore. We're carrying intelligence that could prevent a foreign takeover of American territory. And if Black Jack realizes what I am, what I know, he'll move heaven and earth to kill us before we can report back. Thomas retrieved his rifle, checking the action with practiced efficiency. We need to reach Silver Creek, but we also need to assume that every person we encounter could be compromised. Clara secured the letter in her vest pocket, closer to her heart than the wooden cross Rosa had given her. Both were talismans, no one representing the faith of ordinary people in the possibility of justice, the other representing the formal power of law and government to protect the innocent. Agent Fosterif, he's really in Silver Creek. How will we identify him? Thomas consulted the map he'd drawn from his cache. The letter mentions he's posing as a mining engineer. In a place like Silver Creek, there probably aren't many engineers around. We'll have to take our chances. As they resumed their climb toward the abandoned mining camp, Clara's mind raced with the implications of her recovered memory. She was no longer just a witness to Blackjack's crimes. She was a federal operative carrying intelligence that could bring down an international conspiracy. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. But she was also no longer alone in carrying that burden. Thomas might not be a federal agent, but he was something just as valuably a man with intimate knowledge of the territory, extensive law enforcement experience, and an unshakable moral code. Together, they might actually have a chance of completing her mission. "Thomas," she said as they paused to rest near a natural spring, "what happens after we expose Blackjack's organization? What happens to us?" He was quiet for a moment, filling their canteens with the cool mountain water. "I suppose that depends on whether we survive long enough to worry about it. But if we do," he looked up at her, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart race. "I'd like to find out what we could build together. Not as a federal agent and an ex-sheriff, but as Clara and Thomas. Even knowing that my work might take me away from here, that I might be assigned to other missions, other territories. Even knowing that." Thomas capped his canteen and shouldered his pack. "We've both learned that life's too short and too uncertain to waste time on fear. If we have a chance at happiness, we should take it." Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the desert sun. Despite everything they'd endured, despite the danger that still surrounded them, she found herself believing in the possibility of a future beyond survival. But first, they had to reach Silver Creek alive. And as they crested the final ridge before the mining camp, Clara could see smoke rising from several buildings below, a sign that the supposedly abandoned settlement was very much occupied. "Too much smoke for just a few remaining miners," Thomas observed, studying the scene through his spyglass. "And those buildings look too well maintained for an abandoned camp." Clara accepted the spyglass and focused on the settlement below. What she saw made her blood run cold. "Thomas, those men by the main building, they're wearing badges. Territorial deputies. Or people dressed like territorial deputies." Clara adjusted the focus, studying the figures more closely. "I count at least 8 men, all armed. And they're by the mine entrance, isn't that? Santos." Thomas took back the spyglass and confirmed her observation. "It's a trap. They're using Silver Creek as bait, waiting for us to walk into it. But what about Agent Foster, if he's really down there? Then he's either compromised, dead, or maintaining his cover so deep that we can't count on his help." Thomas lowered the spyglass, his expression grim. "We need to assume we're on our own." Clara studied the terrain around the mining camp, looking for advantages. The settlement was built in a natural bowl surrounded by rocky hills, with only one main access road. It was a perfect place to trap someone, but it was also a perfect place to be trapped if the occupiers couldn't escape quickly. "What if we don't go down there?" she suggested. "What if we find another way to contact Judge Morrison? Morrison was supposed to be holding court in Silver Creek today. If he's not there, we'll have to track him down elsewhere. And every day we spend searching is another day for Blackjack to consolidate his power and eliminate other federal agents." The dilemma was clear. They could try to infiltrate the trap and potentially save Foster and complete the mission, or they could retreat and try to find another way to contact federal authorities. Either choice carried enormous risks. "There's a third option," Clara said suddenly. "What if we turn the trap against them?" Thomas looked at her with interest. "What do you have in mind?" Clara pointed to the hills surrounding the mining camp. "They're expecting us to come down the main road, walk right into their ambush. But what if we came from above? What if we could get close enough to their position to turn this from an ambush into a siege? You're talking about a direct assault on 8 armed men. I'm talking about using the terrain and our knowledge of their plans against them. They think we're desperate fugitives. They don't know I'm a federal agent with training in tactical operations." Thomas studied her face, seeing something there he hadn't noticed before, not just courage, but strategic thinking, honed by federal training she was only now remembering. "What kind of training did they give you?" he asked. "More than I remembered until now. Marksmanship, reconnaissance, basic tactics. The federal government has been preparing for territorial conflicts like this for years. Clara's voice grew more confident as more memories surfaced. I know how to read terrain, how to plan an assault, how to coordinate with other agents. Thomas nodded slowly. Then we do this your way, but we do it smart, and we do it together. As they began planning their approach to Silver Creek, Clara felt the final pieces of her fractured identity falling into place. She was no longer just a schoolteacher, or just a witness, or just a fugitive. She was federal agent Clara Martinez, and she had a job to finish. Thomas spread his hand-drawn map across a flat rock, weighing down the corners with small stones to prevent the mountain wind from stealing their battle plan. The afternoon sun cast sharp shadows across the parchment, highlighting the tactical positions he'd marked around Silver Creek in careful detail. 8 men that we can see, he said, pointing to small X marks scattered around the mining camp. 2 at the main entrance, 2 more by the old assay office, 3 patrolling the perimeter, and Santos positioned near what looks like a command post by the mine superintendent's building. Clara studied the map, her federal training helping her visualize the defensive positions and potential lines of attack. They're spread thin, trying to cover too much ground. Classic mistake when you're expecting your enemy to come from a predictable direction, which works in our favor. Thomas traced a route with his finger, starting from their current position on the ridge and winding down through a series of rocky outcroppings. If we approach from the north face, we can get within 50 yards of their command post without being seen. What about escape routes? Once we start shooting, they'll try to converge on our position. Thomas smiled grimly, and Clara could see the tactical mind that had made him such an effective sheriff. That's where your federal training comes in handy. Look here. He pointed to a narrow canyon that led away from the mining camp toward the east. If we can force them into that canyon, we can pick them off one by one as they try to escape. Clara nodded, understanding the strategy. It was risky, requiring them to expose themselves to enemy fire while maneuvering into position, but it had the advantage of turning the enemy's superior numbers against them. What about Agent Foster? If he's down there, we need to identify him before we start shooting. I've been thinking about that. Thomas pulled out his spyglass and handed it to Clara. Study the men near the mine entrance. Look for someone who doesn't quite fit, too clean, too careful, not comfortable with his weapon. Clara focused the spyglass on the mining camp, studying each visible figure with the careful attention to detail that had made her a good teacher and apparently a capable federal agent. After several minutes, she found what she was looking for. There, she said, handing the spyglass back to Thomas. The man by the minecart tracks. He's wearing work clothes, but they're too new. And look at how he holds his rifle like someone who's had training but doesn't use it regularly. Thomas confirmed her observation. That's got to be Foster. He's positioned himself where he can see the entire camp, but also has quick access to the mine tunnels if he needs to escape. So we have a potential ally, but we can't count on him for support until we can establish contact. Clara checked her weapons one final time, the rifle Thomas had given her from his cache, the revolver she'd learned to shoot with deadly accuracy, and the knife she hoped she wouldn't need to use. How do we signal him when the shooting starts? 3 shots in rapid succession, then a pause, then 2 more. That's an old military signal for friendly forces. If he's really a federal agent, he'll recognize it. As they prepared to begin their descent toward the mining camp, Clara found herself thinking about the people who had helped them reach this point. Rosa and her family, who had risked their own safety to provide shelter and guidance. Father Martinez, who had blessed their journey, even knowing the dangers they faced. The young deputy Warren, who was probably still searching for them, believing he was hunting criminals. Thomas, she said as they gathered their equipment, when this is over, when we've exposed Blackjack's organization and brought the conspirators to justice, what happens to all the people who were misled? The deputies who thought they were serving justice, the officials who didn't know they were being manipulated. Thomas paused in checking his rifle, considering her question. That's not for us to decide. Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty, it's about giving the innocent a chance to make things right. Most of those people, when they learn the truth, will want to be part of the solution. And the ones who don't? Then they'll face the consequences of their choices. Thomas's voice was hard but not cruel. "We can't save everyone, Clara. All we can do is give people the truth and trust them to do the right thing with it." Clara nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words. Her federal training had taught her about the complexities of law enforcement, about the delicate balance between justice and mercy. But it had been her experience with Thomas, their shared trials in the desert, that had taught her about the human cost of that balance. As they began their careful descent down the north face of the ridge, Clara felt a strange sense of completion. Everything that had happened to her recruitment as a federal agent, her capture by Black Jack's gang, her rescue by Thomas, their flight across the desert had led to this moment. She was no longer running from her past or toward an uncertain future. She was living fully in the present, using every skill she possessed to serve justice. The terrain was treacherous, requiring them to move slowly and carefully to avoid starting rock slides that would alert the men below. Clara's feet, now toughened by weeks of desert travel, found purchase on narrow ledges and loose scree. Her hands, calloused from handling weapons and tools, gripped the rocky handholds with confidence. Halfway down the ridge, they encountered their first obstacle patrol, consisting of 2 of Black Jack's men making their way up the trail they needed to use. Thomas signaled for Clara to take position behind a large boulder while he moved to intercept them. What followed was swift and silent. Thomas approached the first man from behind, dispatching him with his knife before the outlaw could cry out. The second man, alerted by his partner's sudden collapse, reached for his gun but never cleared leather. Clara's shot took him center mass, the sound of the gunfire echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. "So much for stealth," Thomas said as shouts erupted from the mining camp below. "They know we're here now." Clara could see men running between the buildings, taking defensive positions and scanning the ridgeline for targets. Santos's voice carried clearly across the desert air as he barked orders, organizing his remaining forces for a siege. "Change of plans," she said, studying the new tactical situation. "They're hunkered down now, waiting for us to come to them. We need to draw them out. What do you suggest?" Clara pointed to a small building at the edge of the mining camp, what looked like a powder magazine, where explosives for mining operations would have been stored. "If we can reach that building and set it off, the explosion will force them out of their defensive positions. That's assuming there's still powder in there, and assuming we can reach it without getting killed." One way to find out. Clara checked her ammunition count and began moving down the ridge again, using the cover of boulders and brush to mask her approach. "Cover me." What followed was the longest 10 minutes of Thomas's life. He watched through his rifle scope as Clara made her way from cover to cover, dodging bullets and return fire as Black Jack's men tried to pin her down. Her federal training was evident in every movement she advanced, using proper tactics, never exposing herself unnecessarily, always having an escape route planned. When she reached the powder magazine, Clara disappeared inside for what felt like an eternity. Thomas kept up steady covering fire, preventing Santos's men from approaching the building while she worked. Then she reappeared, running hard toward a defensive position about 50 yards away. The explosion, when it came, was spectacular. The powder magazine erupted in a pillar of flame and smoke that could probably be seen for miles. The shockwave shattered windows throughout the mining camp and sent several of Black Jack's men diving for cover. In the confusion that followed, Clara's plan worked perfectly. Santos's defensive positions were compromised, his men scattered and disoriented. It was time for the final phase of their assault. Thomas began his own descent, using the chaos to get closer to the command post, where Santos was trying to regroup his forces. In the distance, he could see the figure they'd identified as Agent Foster moving through the smoke, apparently trying to reach a better position. The real battle was about to begin, and everything they'd fought for, justice for Marshal Hayes, protection for the innocent people of the territory, their own chance at a future together hung in the balance. Clara had proven herself as both a federal agent and a partner. Now it was time to finish what they'd started. The documents scattered across the makeshift table in the mine superintendent's office told the complete story of Black Jack's conspiracy. Clara pressed her back against the door frame, rifle ready, while Thomas gathered the evidence that would bring down not just an outlaw gang, but an international plot against American territorial sovereignty. "Letters from Heinrich Kruger," Thomas said, stuffing papers into his saddlebag as gunfire erupted outside. "Mining surveys marked with false information. Bills of sale for equipment that was never delivered, and this," he held up a leather portfolio bound with ribbon, "correspondence with European investors, detailing plans to manipulate railroad development." Clara fired twice at movement near the assay office, driving back one of Santos's men who was trying to flank their position. "How much more do you need?" "This is enough to hang half the territorial government," Thomas replied, securing the portfolio in his vest. "But we still need to get it to federal authorities who can act on it." The explosion of the powder magazine had given them the opening they needed to reach the command post, but it had also alerted every outlaw within miles to their presence. Through the smoke and confusion, Clara could see riders approaching from multiple directions, Black Jack's entire organization converging on Silver Creek for a final confrontation. "There!" Clara pointed toward the mine entrance, where a figure in work clothes was signaling to them with a piece of white cloth. "That has to be Foster." Agent David Foster looked nothing like the mining engineer he was supposed to be. His face was lean and alert, his movements precise and economical, the bearing of a man accustomed to danger. When Thomas and Clara reached his position near the minecart tracks, he was already organizing their next move. "Federal Agent Foster," he said by way of introduction, showing them his commission badge. "I've been maintaining cover here for 3 months, documenting Black Jack's operations. When I saw the explosion, I knew it had to be you." "Agent Martinez," Clara replied, finally able to use her real title. "This is Thomas Whitmore, former Lincoln County Sheriff. We have evidence of the conspiracy between Black Jack's organization and territorial officials." "Good, because we're going to need it." Foster pointed toward the approaching dust clouds. "Black Jack himself is riding with that group from the south. He's bringing at least 20 men, and they're not planning to take prisoners." Thomas counted the approaching riders through his spyglass. 23, maybe 24, plus Santos and the remaining men here in camp. We're outnumbered 8-1. "Then we'd better be 8 times smarter," Clara said, studying the terrain around the mining camp. "Foster, what do you know about the mine tunnels? Are they deep enough to provide cover?" "Deep enough, but they're also a trap if we get cornered down there." Foster led them toward the mine entrance, keeping low to avoid the sporadic gunfire from Santos's remaining men. "However, there's a back entrance about half a mile north, hidden behind a rockfall. If we can reach it, we can move through the tunnels and come up behind Black Jack's main force." Clara liked the plan immediately. Her federal training had emphasized the importance of mobility and surprise in situations where the enemy had numerical superiority. How long would it take to traverse the tunnels? 20 minutes, maybe 30 if we're careful about lighting. But once Black Jack arrives, he'll post guards at both entrances. We need to move now. As they prepared to enter the mine, Clara caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. Riding at the head of the approaching column was a figure she recognized, not Black Jack, but Deputy Warren, the young lawman they'd encountered days earlier. Santos had apparently convinced him that they were dangerous criminals who needed to be stopped at any cost. "Thomas," she said, pointing toward the approaching riders. "Warren's with them. They've turned him completely." Thomas studied the young deputy through his spyglass, his expression grim. "He's riding point for the main column, probably thinks he's about to arrest a couple of murderers. Santos has played this perfectly. He's got legitimate law enforcement providing cover for Black Jack's operation." The implications were staggering. If federal agents killed territorial deputies, even corrupt ones, it would create a political crisis that could undermine the entire territorial government. Black Jack was using Warren and probably other honest lawmen as human shields, forcing Clara and Thomas to choose between completing their mission and avoiding a bloodbath. "We need to separate Warren from the main group," Clara said. "Give him a chance to learn the truth before it's too late." "How?" Foster asked. Once the shooting starts, he'll be just another target. Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking through possibilities. Then she reached into her vest and withdrew her federal commission, the document that had revealed her true identity. What if we could get this to him? Show him what's really happening here. He'll think it's forged, Thomas pointed out. Black Jack's probably told him we're desperate criminals who'll say anything to avoid capture. Then we show him something he can't dismiss. Clara began writing quickly on the back of the commission document, using a pencil from her pack. A message about the real conspiracy, with details only a federal agent would know. Names, dates, specific criminal acts. If Warren's really an honest lawman, he'll recognize the truth when he sees it. Foster nodded approvingly. It's worth trying, but how do we get it to him without getting shot? I know Warren, Thomas said. He's young, but he's not stupid. If we can arrange a parley, get him to listen for just a few minutes, we might be able to turn him. The sound of approaching hoofbeats was getting louder, and Clara could see individual riders now through the dust and smoke. Black Jack himself was unmistakably a tall man with a black beard and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He rode with the confidence of a man who believed he'd finally cornered his enemies. Into the mine, Foster ordered. We'll use the tunnels to get behind them, then try to separate Warren from the main group. It's our only chance. As they descended into the darkness of the abandoned silver mine, Clara felt the weight of the federal commission in her pocket, not just as identification, but as a symbol of everything they were fighting for. The rule of law, the protection of the innocent, the idea that justice could triumph over corruption if good people were willing to fight for it. The mine tunnels were a maze of interconnected passages, some natural caves that had been expanded by miners, others carved entirely from the living rock. Foster led them confidently through the darkness, his familiarity with the layout allowing them to move quickly, despite the danger of cave-ins and hidden shafts. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of Black Jack's men taking positions around the mining camp, calling out orders and organizing search parties. It wouldn't be long before someone thought to check the mine entrances, but by then Clara hoped they would be in position to turn the tables on their pursuers. As they emerged from the hidden back entrance, Clara could see the full scope of Black Jack's operation. At least 30 men now surrounded Silver Creek, armed with rifles and positioned to prevent any escape. It was an impressive show of force, but it was also an opportunity. With so many men concentrated in one area, a small group with superior tactics could cause disproportionate damage. There, Foster pointed toward a rocky outcropping that overlooked the main camp. We can set up a crossfire from that position, force them to choose between cover and mobility. Clara studied the terrain, her mind automatically calculating angles of fire and escape routes. But she also found herself thinking about Warren, about the choice he would have to make when he learned the truth about the men he was fighting alongside. The final battle was about to begin, and everything they'd sacrificed to reach this point would be tested in the crucible of combat. Thomas pinned his tarnished deputy star to his vest with steady hands, the metal catching the last rays of desert sunlight. The badge felt heavier than he remembered, weighted with years of regret and the promise of redemption. Around him, the sounds of Black Jack's men positioning themselves for the final assault echoed off the canyon walls. "You don't have to do this," Clara said, checking her rifle one last time. "The badge doesn't make you more of a lawman than you already are." "Maybe not. But it reminds me who I used to be and who I can be again." Thomas looked toward the mining camp, where Deputy Warren was taking position with Black Jack's main force. "That boy down there, he still believes in justice, even if he's been misled about who serves it. I want him to see that some of us never stopped fighting for what's right." Agent Foster had taken position on the opposite side of the canyon, creating the crossfire they needed to break up Black Jack's defensive positions. The plan was simple: in theory force the outlaws out of cover, separate Warren from the main group, and eliminate Black Jack before he could escape with knowledge that would compromise other federal operations. In practice, Clara knew it would be chaos. The attack began at sunset, when the changing light would make it harder for Black Jack's men to see their attackers clearly. Foster's rifle cracked from across the canyon, the shot taking down one of the sentries near the mine entrance. Immediately, the entire camp erupted in confusion as men scrambled for cover and tried to locate the source of the gunfire. Thomas and Clara opened fire from their position on the ridge, their shots carefully aimed to drive the outlaws toward the center of the camp, where they would be most vulnerable. Clara's federal training served her well. She moved and fired with professional precision, each shot calculated for maximum tactical effect. But it was the sight of Thomas in action that truly impressed her. The star on his vest seemed to transform him, restoring the confidence and authority that had made him a legendary sheriff. He moved through the rocks like a ghost, appearing just long enough to take a shot before vanishing again, always staying one step ahead of return fire. There, Clara pointed toward a group of men trying to reach the horses tied near the assay office. Warren's with them. Thomas studied the situation through his rifle scope. The young deputy was indeed moving with a group of outlaws, but his body language suggested confusion rather than commitment. He kept looking around as if trying to understand what was happening, why federal agents were shooting at territorial lawmen. "Cover me," Thomas said, beginning to work his way down toward the camp. "I'm going to try to reach him." Clara wanted to protest, to point out that exposing himself to get close to Warren was tactically unsound. But she also understood that this wasn't just about tactics anymore. It was about saving a young man's faith in the system he'd sworn to serve. The battle intensified as Thomas made his way toward Warren's position. Santos had organized his remaining men into a defensive line, using the mining equipment as cover while they tried to identify and eliminate the attackers. From their elevated position, Clara could see the desperation in their movements. They knew they were trapped, but they also knew that surrender meant hanging. A bullet whined past Thomas's head as he sprinted between buildings, forcing him to dive behind a pile of mine tailings. Clara immediately shifted her fire to suppress the sniper who had targeted him, her shots chipping stone from the building where the man had taken cover. "Warren!" Thomas called out when he was within earshot of the deputy. "Deputy Warren, this is Sheriff Thomas Whitmore. I need to talk to you." The young lawman looked confused, his rifle wavering as he tried to process this unexpected development. "You're supposed to be dead. Santos said you were killed resisting arrest." "Santos lied to you, son, just like he's been lying about everything else." Thomas raised his hands to show he wasn't aiming his weapon. "I'm going to throw you something. Read it, and then decide who you want to fight for." The federal commission wrapped around a stone landed at Warren's feet. As he unwrapped it and began reading Clara's hastily written explanation of the conspiracy, his expression changed from confusion to shock to anger. "This can't be right," Warren said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Mr. Santos said you murdered a federal marshal." "Agent Martinez is a federal marshal," Thomas replied. "She witnessed Black Jack murder Marshal Hayes, and Santos has been hunting her ever since to keep her quiet." Warren looked around at the men he'd been fighting alongside, seeing them clearly for the first time. Their movements, their weapons, their casual brutality toward the local population, none of it matched the behavior of legitimate lawmen pursuing justice. The moment of Warren's realization was interrupted by a new development that changed everything. Black Jack himself emerged from the mine superintendent's office, and in his grip was a figure that made Clara's blood run cold. Rosa Chavez, the woman who had given her the wooden cross, the mother who had risked her family's safety to help them. "Enough!" Black Jack's voice carried clearly across the mining camp. "I know you're up there, Martinez. Come down and surrender, or this woman dies." Clara could see Rosa's terrified face, could see the knife Black Jack held to her throat. Behind them, two more outlaws emerged from the building, dragging Rosa's husband and children. The family that had shown them kindness was now being used as human shields in Black Jack's desperate gambit. "How did they?" Clara began, then stopped as she realized the terrible truth. Black Jack's men had ridden to the settlement of San Miguel, had taken Rosa's family hostage to use against them. The consequences of their actions had fallen on innocent people, just as Thomas had warned. "You have 1 minute to show yourself," Blackjack called out. Then I start killing them one by one, starting with the children. Clara felt the world narrow to a single point of focus. All her federal training, all her newfound skills with weapons and tactics meant nothing if she couldn't protect the people who had helped her. She began to rise from her position, ready to surrender herself to save Rosa's family. Thomas's hand on her arm stopped her. "Wait," he said quietly. "Look at Warren." The young deputy had made his choice. Instead of continuing to fight alongside Blackjack's men, he was moving carefully toward a position where he could get a clear shot at the outlaw leader. His face was set with the determined expression of a man who had finally understood the difference between law and justice. "On my signal," Thomas whispered, "Warren will take the shot at Blackjack. Foster will hit the men holding the family. You and I eliminate any remaining threats." Clara nodded, understanding the plan. It was risky, requiring split-second timing and perfect execution, but it was their only chance to save Rosa's family and complete their mission. The signal came in the form of Thomas's voice, calling out across the canyon with the authority of a man who had never stopped being a sheriff. "Warren now." The young deputy's shot was perfect, taking Blackjack center mass and dropping him instantly. Foster's rifle spoke twice from across the canyon, eliminating the men who held Rosa's family. Clara and Thomas emerged from cover, their weapons trained on the remaining outlaws, who were now leaderless and confused. "Drop your weapons," Thomas commanded, his badge glinting in the firelight. "This is over." One by one, the surviving outlaws laid down their guns and raised their hands. Santos, wounded but alive, glared at them with hatred but offered no further resistance. The conspiracy that had threatened the entire territory was finally broken. As Clara ran toward Rosa's family to make sure they were unharmed, she felt the wooden cross in her pocket and understood its true meaning. It wasn't just a symbol of faith, it was a reminder that good people would always find ways to help each other, even in the darkest times. The battle was won, but the work of justice was just beginning. The deed to their new ranch felt crisp and official in Clara's hands as she stood on the porch of what would soon be their home. The small adobe house sat in a valley 20 miles north of Las Cruces, far enough from the territorial capital to avoid the political aftermath of Blackjack's conspiracy, close enough to the growing community for Clara to establish her new school. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at Silver Creek. The evidence they'd gathered had brought down Heinrich Kruger and a dozen other corrupt officials, while exposing the foreign cartel's attempts to manipulate American territorial development. Federal marshals had arrested conspirators from Santa Fe to Denver, and the territorial government had been reformed under new leadership. Thomas emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, his movements still careful due to the bullet wound he'd taken during the final battle. The injury had healed well, but it served as a permanent reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. "Deputy Warren stopped by while you were in town," he said, settling into the chair beside her on the porch. "He wanted to thank us again for opening his eyes to the truth." Clara smiled, thinking about the young lawman who had found the courage to choose justice over misguided loyalty. Warren had been promoted to sheriff of Doña Ana County, and his first official act had been to establish new protocols for verifying the legitimacy of federal warrants and territorial orders. "What did you tell him?" "That he did the hard part himself. We just gave him the information he needed to make the right choice." Thomas sipped his coffee, his gaze distant. He also brought news from Agent Foster. "The federal investigation is wrapping up, and there's talk of establishing a permanent territorial security office to prevent future conspiracies." Clara nodded, unsurprised by the development. Her own federal commission had been officially restored with commendation, and she'd been offered a position heading the new office. But she'd turned it down, choosing instead to request assignment to education and community development work that would allow her to build rather than hunt. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked, reading her expression. "About turning down the promotion?" "No." Clara reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "I spent enough time chasing outlaws and conspirators. I'd rather spend my energy teaching children to read and helping communities grow strong enough to resist corruption on their own. The deed to their new ranch felt crisp and official in Clara's hands as she stood on the porch of what would soon be their home. The small adobe house sat in a valley 20 miles north of Las Cruces, far enough from the territorial capital to avoid the political aftermath of Blackjack's conspiracy, close enough to the growing community for Clara to establish her new school. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at Silver Creek. The evidence they'd gathered had brought down Heinrich Kruger and a dozen other corrupt officials, while exposing the foreign cartel's attempts to manipulate American territorial development. Federal marshals had arrested conspirators from Santa Fe to Denver, and the territorial government had been reformed under new leadership. Thomas emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, his movements still careful due to the bullet wound he'd taken during the final battle. The injury had healed well, but it served as a permanent reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. "Deputy Warren stopped by while you were in town," he said, settling into the chair beside her on the porch. "He wanted to thank us again for opening his eyes to the truth." Clara smiled, thinking about the young lawman who had found the courage to choose justice over misguided loyalty. Warren had been promoted to sheriff of Doña Ana County, and his first official act had been to establish new protocols for verifying the legitimacy of federal warrants and territorial orders. "What did you tell him?" "That he did the hard part himself. We just gave him the information he needed to make the right choice." Thomas sipped his coffee, his gaze distant. He also brought news from Agent Foster. "The federal investigation is wrapping up, and there's talk of establishing a permanent territorial security office to prevent future conspiracies." Clara nodded, unsurprised by the development. Her own federal commission had been officially restored with commendation, and she'd been offered a position heading the new office. But she'd turned it down, choosing instead to request assignment to education and community development work that would allow her to build rather than hunt. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked, reading her expression. "About turning down the promotion?" "No." Clara reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "I spent enough time chasing outlaws and conspirators. I'd rather spend my energy teaching children to read and helping communities grow strong enough to resist corruption on their own." Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "And the other decision? Marrying a broken-down ex-sheriff with more scars than sense?" Clara laughed, the sound carrying across the valley like music. "Especially not that decision, though I might have to reconsider if you keep calling yourself broken down." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains that had once seemed so hostile and were now simply home. In the distance, Clara could see the small schoolhouse that was nearing completion, built with lumber, donated by grateful families, and labor provided by men who understood the value of education in building strong communities. Rosa Chavez and her family had been among the first to settle in the valley, drawn by the promise of good land and honest law enforcement. Rosa's children would be among Clara's first students, along with Warren's younger brother and the children of several families who had moved to the area specifically because of its reputation for justice and opportunity. "There's something I need to tell you," Clara said, reaching into her pocket and withdrawing a familiar object, Rosa's wooden cross, worn smooth by years of handling and weeks of desperate prayer. "I've been carrying this since the day Rosa gave it to me, but I think it's time to pass it on." "To whom?" "To our school, as a reminder that faith and education go hand in hand, that both require people willing to stand up for what's right." Clara smiled, imagining the cross hanging in the schoolroom where children would see it every day. Rosa's grandmother carried it through the Apache Wars. Rosa carried it through poverty and hardship. I carried it through the desert and the battle with Blackjack. Now it should inspire the next generation." Thomas nodded, understanding the symbolism. "A legacy of courage, passed from one generation to the next." "Exactly." Clara stood, pulling him up beside her. "Come on, there's one more thing I want to show you before it gets too dark." They walked together toward the partially completed schoolhouse, their footsteps echoing in the evening stillness. Inside, the basic structure was complete wooden floors, whitewashed walls, and large windows that would let in plenty of natural light. But it was what Clara had painted on the wall behind where her desk would sit that made Thomas smile. In careful script, she had written a simple message. Justice is not just the absence of corruption, but the presence of people willing to fight for what is right. Marshall Hayes would have liked that, Thomas said. I hope so. I hope everyone who enters this room understands that education is not just about learning facts, but about learning to think for yourself, to stand up for others, to make the world a little better than you found it. As they stood in the empty schoolroom, Clara could almost see the children who would soon fill these desks, boys and girls whose lives would be shaped by the lessons they learned here, who would grow up understanding that one person's courage could make all the difference in the world. Do you think we'll have peace? Clara asked. Real peace, not just the absence of immediate danger. Thomas considered the question carefully. I think we'll have what we've always had, good people working to build something better and other people trying to tear it down. The difference is that now there are more of us who know the truth, who understand what we're fighting for. Clara nodded, satisfied with that answer. Perfect peace might be impossible, but the kind of peace that came from knowing you'd done everything possible to protect the innocent that was achievable. As they walked back toward their house, Clara thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She'd started as a naive schoolteacher who believed that education alone could solve the world's problems. She'd learned that sometimes education had to be backed up with courage, that sometimes protecting the innocent required taking up arms against those who would prey upon them. But she'd also learned that the ultimate goal was always to return to building, to teaching, to creating communities strong enough to resist corruption from within and threats from without. The weapons and tactics she'd mastered were tools to be used when necessary, but they were not the end goal. The end goal was this: a peaceful valley where children could learn and families could prosper under the protection of just laws enforced by honest people. Thomas opened the door to their house, and warm light spilled out onto the porch. Inside, Clara could see the books she'd ordered for the new school, stacked carefully on the table where they would be sorted and catalogued. Beside them lay Thomas's commission as the valley's first sheriff, signed by territorial authorities who had been thoroughly vetted for honesty and integrity. "Ready to go inside, Mrs. Whitmore?" Thomas asked, using the name she would officially take in just 2 weeks when the territorial judge arrived to perform their wedding ceremony. Clara Martinez Whitmore, federal agent, teacher, wife, protector of the innocent, builder of communities. She liked the sound of all of those titles and the way they worked together to create someone stronger than any of them alone. "Ready," she said, and stepped into the light.